They say American trucks are built tough, but not every rig that rolled off the line lived up to the legend. Some were awkward experiments, others were mechanical disasters, and a few were just plain doomed from day one. In this video, we're diving into the darker side of American trucking history, the forgotten, the flawed, and the flat-out failures. These aren't your everyday pickups or the classics you see at shows. These are the trucks you've probably never even heard of. From cab-over oddities and diesel guzzlers to overpriced luxury flops and industrial giants that missed the mark, we've rounded up 20 of the worst American trucks ever made. They were uncomfortable to drive, unreliable to own, or simply didn't make sense in the real world. Some were born from bold ideas that crashed and burned. Others tried to change the game, but ended up in the scrapyard instead. Whether they were too ahead of their time or just hopelessly behind, these trucks vanished into obscurity. And trust us, most of them deserved it. So if you love weird automotive history, rare rigs, or just want to see what not to do when building a truck, you're in the right place. This is our countdown of the 20 worst American trucks you've never seen, starting right now with number 20. Number 20, the White 3000 COE promised efficiency with its cab-over engine layout, but in reality, it was one of the roughest rides a trucker could endure. Built in an era when practicality trumped comfort, it featured weak engine options that struggled under heavy loads and delivered lackluster performance. The cab, perched directly above the front axle, amplified every bump in the road, and the tight interior left little room for driver comfort or storage. Noise and heat from the engine made long hauls feel like punishment, not work. Maintenance was no picnic either, requiring awkward cab tilts for even basic repairs. While its compact footprint suited urban deliveries, the overall experience was harsh and outdated, even by the standards of its time. It might look cool today, but back then, it was more of a burden than a breakthrough. Would you really want to relive those bone-rattling miles behind the wheel? Number 19. The GMC Astro 95 looked futuristic with its flat-faced cab and space-age name, but driving it was far from high-tech. Introduced in the 1960s, it aimed to compete in the growing cab-over market, yet fell short in several key areas. The cab was noisy, poorly insulated, and sat high without proper suspension, making every mile a jarring experience. Engine access was frustrating, reliability was hit or miss, and the build quality showed clear signs of cost-cutting. Visibility was decent, but driver ergonomics were almost an afterthought, with a boxy dash and cramped quarters. It may have looked bold, but performance and comfort were sorely lacking. For all its style, the Astro 95 ended up being more about image than substance. Would you put your long-haul trust in a truck that looked cool but drove like a punishment? Number 18. The Mack Cruiseliner had bold looks and a name that promised smooth sailing, but in reality, it was a rough ride from start to finish. Launched in the 70s to keep Mack in the COE game, it suffered from the usual cab-over flaws, cramped space, a brutal ride, and constant engine noise just inches from the driver's seat. The cab design looked aerodynamic, but the interior was dated and tight, with awkward controls and limited storage. Engine access was frustrating despite the tilt cab design, and reliability was hit or miss depending on the configuration. While it carried the tough Mack badge, the Cruiseliner lacked the durability and comfort long-haul drivers needed. It may have had presence on the road, but inside it felt more like a punishment than a privilege. Would you really want to spend your work week crammed into this steel box on wheels? Number 17. The International Transtar II CO4070 might have looked like a serious hauler, but living with it was a test of patience. Released in the 70s, it featured the typical cab-over engine layout, which meant sitting directly over the axle and engine, resulting in relentless noise, heat, and a bone-jarring ride. The interior was cramped and Spartan, with barely enough room to stretch, let alone live in during long hauls. Engine access was technically improved with a tilt cab, But real-world repairs were still a hassle thanks to tight spaces and complex routing. Though it offered a range of powertrains, even the higher-output diesels struggled with reliability over time. The Transtar II looked modern for its era, but comfort, refinement, and ease of maintenance were sorely lacking. For a truck meant to conquer highways, it made every mile feel like a chore. Would you choose style over sanity behind the wheel? Number 16. The Freightliner Powerliner was supposed to be a heavy-duty titan, boasting big horsepower and serious hauling potential. But for drivers, it often felt more like a mechanical beast that fought back. Introduced in the mid-70s, it was Freightliner's answer to the growing demand for high-powered trucks, often equipped with massive Detroit diesel or Cummins engines. While that might sound impressive, the cab-over-engine layout combined with an oversized power plant made for a hot, noisy, and downright brutal experience inside the cab. The ride was harsh, the interior was tight and dated, and driver ergonomics were barely an afterthought. Every shift felt like a wrestling match, and creature comforts were virtually non-existent. Maintenance was a nightmare too, with complex engine setups crammed under the cab, making even routine service a tedious process. Sure, it could pull like a beast, but it punished you for every mile. It was raw power with no polish. Would you really trade comfort and sanity just to haul heavier loads a little faster? Number 15. The Ford LTL 9000 came in with big chrome and bold styling, but behind that long nose was a truck that never quite lived up to its highway-crushing image. Introduced in the late 70s as Ford's top-tier long-haul rig, it looked the part with a massive grille and stretched hood. But the execution left a lot to be desired. The ride quality was stiff, especially compared to smoother competitors, and the interior, while spacious, felt dated quickly. Rattling plastic trim, awkward control placement, and limited insulation made long drives feel longer. Despite offering strong engine options like the Cummins Big Cam or Caterpillar 3406, the truck was plagued with inconsistent build quality and electrical gremlins that frustrated even seasoned mechanics. Parts support was spotty, especially as Ford slowly backed out of the heavy-duty market. It might have looked like a premium hauler, but it often fell short in refinement and long-term reliability. Would you really trust your livelihood to a truck that looked better parked than pulling a grade? Number 14. The Brockway 761 had the tough, old-school look of a working-class hero, but behind the rugged grille was a truck that felt stuck in time. Built during the 70s as part of Brockway's final run before the brand was shut down, the 761 struggled to keep up with rapidly advancing competitors. Its cab was basic and cramped, with minimal insulation, loud engine noise, and a ride that punished drivers on every bump. The controls felt heavy, visibility was limited by thick pillars, and interior ergonomics were an afterthought. While it came with reliable engine options like the Cummins NH or Detroit Diesel 8V71, the truck's outdated design, hard-to-find parts, and limited dealer support made ownership a headache. The tilt hood looked great but didn't make repairs any easier thanks to tight component packaging. It had the heart of a workhorse but the comfort of a cattle chute. Would you really want to tackle modern roads in a rig that belonged to yesterday? Number 13. The International Harvester Emeryville might hold nostalgic charm today, but back in its prime, it was a rough, unforgiving machine that tested drivers daily. Introduced in the late 50s and running through the 60s, it was one of the early cab-over-engine designs built for tight urban maneuvering and better trailer length. But that came at a steep cost. The cab was brutally cramped, with barely enough room to shift in your seat, let alone store gear or sleep. Engine noise, heat, and vibration poured into the cab through minimal insulation, turning every mile into a sensory assault. The ride quality was stiff and jarring, especially on long hauls, and basic tasks like engine service were a chore due to tight quarters and awkward access. While it had solid engines like the Cummins NH220, the truck's overall comfort, ergonomics, and longevity just didn't stack up as time marched on. It looked sharp and served a purpose, but driving one felt more like endurance training than trucking. Would you really want to relive that daily grind from the driver's seat? Number 12, the White Road Boss. The two came with a name that suggested dominance, but driving it felt more like a constant compromise than commanding the road. Introduced in the 70s as a rugged, no-nonsense conventional, it quickly showed its age with a stiff ride, noisy cab, and a bare-bones interior that lacked any sense of refinement. Driver comfort was an afterthought. Tight quarters, rattling panels, minimal insulation, and poor ventilation made long days feel endless. While it offered solid engine options like the Cummins NTC or Detroit Diesel Series 60, accessing components for repairs was frustrating, especially with its tight engine bay and wiring gremlins that seemed to plague many models. Build quality varied wildly, and as the White brand struggled financially, parts support became increasingly unreliable. It had the bones of a workhorse, but the finish of a budget bruiser. Would you really want to hit the highway in a truck that felt outdated the day it rolled off the line? Number 11. The Oshkosh P-Series was built for extremes, but if you had to drive one daily, it felt more like a punishment than a privilege. Designed for military, construction, and off-road utility, it was brutally overbuilt for regular highway use. The cab was tight, noisy, and rode like a brick. Every bump sent a jolt through your spine, and the lack of suspension refinement made long hauls exhausting. Visibility was poor due to the thick, armored-like structure, and steering felt more like guiding a tank than a truck. Engine access was awkward, and routine maintenance was slowed by the truck's rugged, no-compromise layout. While it could crawl through just about anything, comfort, drivability, and ease of use were completely overlooked. It was a machine that worked hard, but made you work even harder. Would you want to fight your truck just to get the job done? Number 10. The Ford CL9000 had futuristic styling for its time, but driving it was anything but forward-thinking. This cab-over rig, introduced in the 70s, featured a tilt cab and bold design, but that's where the praise stopped. The cab was loud, cramped, and sat right over the engine, turning heat, vibration, and constant noise into your daily companions. Ride quality was harsh, and the minimal interior comforts made long hauls feel like endurance runs. The tilt mechanism, while innovative, became a headache when dealing with frequent maintenance issues, especially with aging electrical systems and rattling panels. It may have looked sleek, but the real experience was rough, noisy, and fatiguing. Would you really want to spend your work week strapped to a rolling echo chamber with no mercy for your back or sanity? Number 9. The Kenworth K100E Aerodyne II had iconic looks and a high-roof sleeper that screamed innovation. But behind the bold styling was a truck that wore out drivers fast. As a cab-over-engine design, it placed you directly over the front axle and engine, meaning constant noise, heat, and a punishing ride. Despite the Aerodyne sleeper upgrades, the cab was still tight, with awkward storage, limited insulation, and barely enough room to move around. Tilting the cab for engine access was a hassle, especially when dealing with complex wiring and aging components. Visibility was decent, but steering feel and comfort lagged behind conventional rivals. It had attitude and presence, but on long hauls it was more of a workout than a workspace. Would you really choose style and nostalgia over comfort and sanity? Number 8. The International 9670 Eagle looked sharp with its squared-off cab and signature Eagle badging, but driving it exposed all the classic cab-over flaws, and then some. Released in the 80s, it tried to offer a premium feel, yet the cramped cab, rough ride, and constant engine noise told a different story. Sitting directly over the front axle meant every pothole felt like a punch. And while the sleeper was larger than earlier models, it was still tight, with dated ergonomics and poor insulation. Tilting the cab for service sounded easy, but frequent electrical issues and tight engine compartments turned maintenance into a chore. It had presence on the road, sure, but comfort, reliability, and ease of use didn't quite live up to the badge. Would you really want to haul coast to coast in a truck that looked better on a brochure than behind the wheel? Number 7. The Marmon Conventional 57P was often called the Rolls-Royce of trucks, but that luxury image didn't always translate to real-world performance. Built by a small manufacturer with limited resources, the 57P suffered from inconsistent build quality, outdated engineering, and a parts supply that bordered on non-existent. While it had a sharp, hand-built exterior and a roomy cab, the interior felt more show than go. Creaky panels, basic ergonomics, and minimal insulation made it far less comfortable than it looked. Ride quality was stiff, and reliability was hit or miss depending on how it was spec'd. Worse yet, getting service or replacement parts was a constant battle due to the company's low production volume and eventual closure. It had character, no doubt, but would you really want to rely on a rare boutique rig that's more collector's item than workhorse? Number 6. The White-GMC WX64 was built for tight urban routes and vocational tasks, but driving it felt more like punishment than productivity. With its cab-over design and low-entry setup, it was great for visibility and maneuverability, but the trade-offs were brutal. The cab was noisy, cramped, and rode like a steel drum on square wheels, offering little insulation from engine heat, vibration, or road noise. Interior space was minimal, with stiff seats and awkward control layouts that made long shifts exhausting. Maintenance access was frustrating too, with cramped engine bays and aging electrical systems prone to failure. It did its job, sure, but it made sure you felt every second of it. Would you really want to tackle city streets in a truck that treats comfort like an afterthought? Number 5. The Freightliner FLB had that classic cab-over look and solid fleet appeal. But behind the squared-off face was a truck that wore drivers down fast. Designed for tight spaces and short-haul efficiency, it delivered on maneuverability, but sacrificed comfort in the process. The cab was loud, cramped, and sat directly over the engine and axle, turning every trip into a test of endurance with constant heat, vibration, and a punishing ride. Interior space was minimal despite the sleeper option, with awkward storage, dated materials, and barely there insulation. Maintenance was also a hassle, with hard-to-reach components and a tilt cab that didn't always cooperate. It may have been practical on paper, but in the driver's seat, it felt more like a rolling compromise. Would you really want to spend your day crammed in a box that never lets you forget you're in a truck? Number 4. The Ford Aeromax L9000 tried to blend aerodynamics with heavy-duty performance. But under that sleek hood was a truck that never quite delivered on comfort or longevity. Introduced in the late 80s, it looked modern for its time, yet the ride was stiff, the cab noisy, and interior quality left a lot to be desired. Cheap plastics, basic controls, and poor insulation made long hauls feel longer, while electrical gremlins and building consistencies frustrated owners and mechanics alike. Even with solid engine options like the Cummins or Caterpillar diesels, reliability was hit or miss depending on the spec. As Ford slowly exited the heavy truck game, parts support dried up, making repairs harder over time. It had style, sure, but would you really want to rely on a truck that looked fast but aged poorly where it counted most? Number 3. The Sterling A9500 was meant to be a practical, no-frills workhorse, but in reality, it often felt like a rushed patchwork of borrowed parts and missed opportunities. Built during the Daimler era, using a mix of Freightliner components, the truck suffered from inconsistent quality and a lack of identity. The cab was roomy but plagued with cheap plastics, rattling panels, and poor insulation that let in too much road noise and heat. Ride comfort was mediocre, and electrical issues were common, especially with aging wiring and poorly integrated systems. While engine options like the Detroit Series 60 were solid, the rest of the truck struggled to keep up. After Sterling was discontinued, Parts availability became a major headache. It did the job, but just barely. Would you really trust a truck that faded away faster than its reputation ever got a chance to grow? Number 2. The Western Star 5700XE was marketed as a bold mix of classic styling and modern aerodynamics, but in practice it missed the mark on both comfort and consistency. Despite its aggressive looks, the ride was harsh, with a stiff suspension and poor cab isolation that made long hauls tiring. Inside, the dash layout felt cluttered, materials were subpar for a premium truck, and driver ergonomics were awkward, especially for taller drivers. While it featured strong engine options like the Detroit DD15, the truck was plagued with electrical glitches, HVAC failures, and trim pieces that didn't hold up over time. It tried to blend rugged charm with efficiency, but ended up feeling more like a compromise than a contender. Would you really want to spend your miles in a truck that looks sharp, but wears you down with every shift? Number 1. The Navistar International LoneStar made a bold entrance with its flashy, retro-inspired design, but beneath the chrome and curves was a truck that often let drivers down. It prioritized looks over function, with massive fenders that hurt visibility and an oversized grille that did little for real aerodynamics. Inside, the cab was spacious, but filled with cheap materials, clunky ergonomics, and inconsistent build quality. The early models were plagued by the disastrous Mack Force engines, known for reliability issues and costly emissions problems. Even with later improvements, the LoneStar remained more show than substance. Heavy, awkward to maneuver, and hard to maintain. It looked like a highway hero, but felt like a diva on the job. Would you really bet your livelihood on a truck that puts style before staying power?